Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 30th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep it going is by relying on the really generous support of individuals just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, that's patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Victor Ryabtsev, Krister Jansen, Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Thomas Sidovich, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Brian Holden, Chuck Blell, David Compton, Eric Solo Hogsbow, that's probably not right, I apologize, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, Ulrika Hagman, and so many more. Thank you all so much for all of your incredible support. Wow, I feel really blessed. This week is a continuation from last week. I'm really excited to reintroduce to you Dr. Tricia Rose. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, I do recommend that you listen to that one first. Tricia is Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies and Director of the Systemic Racism Project at Brown University. She's also the author of 3 books, including The Hip Hop Wars, and she received fellowships from the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations for one of those books. And her research has also been funded by the Mellon and Robert Wood Johnson Foundations. So this is a continuation talking about her newest book, which is called Metaracism: How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Tricia Rose. Well, Tricia, I am so glad to have you back for a part 2 to talk about your incredible work on meta-racism. The last time that we met, which in real time was several weeks ago, but in podcast time was last week. So that's going to be a weird jump for us, time traveling a bit. Yeah. We had covered a bit of ground, but I don't know. I just felt like it was too tight. We were squeezing it in between, other meetings and other work things. And I didn't feel like it was enough. So I'm just really grateful for you to.
I'm thrilled to be back. I did feel like we had things to say we didn't get to. So there's nothing wrong with a conversation that, needs more air. I think that's the best compliment of any conversation, that you want to do more of it. So I'm all in.
Good. So I was hoping that maybe just right off the bat, we could dive in, and a little bit of this will be re-summarizing, but I think some of it will be new, is to talk about the title and how the title is carried through the book. This concept of meta-racism, as opposed to what I think a lot of people might think of as definitional racism, or what people might reference when trying to point out racism in America.
Yeah, that is a big question, and luckily the book does answer this. So it wasn't a teaser. There is an answer. But first, let me say that meta-racism is a quality of compounded discrimination caused by systemic racism. So meta-racism is an outcome, right? It's what happens in an effective system. So let me back up a little bit into a phrase you used, which was very helpful, which is sort of, how we define racism, right? You said sort of, it raises the question, in terms of how meta-racism relates to how we describe racism. And that question is actually at the heart of the book. And the purpose of the book is to say, hey, look, U.S. citizens primarily, and any others who are interested, we have told ourselves that with the end of the civil rights movement, we ended forced legal segregation and racial discrimination. And in that moment of ending it, we've ended racism as a systemic, society-wide phenomenon. In its place is an ever-shrinking body of leftover people who are haters and hatred and bigoted and violent. And over time, disparities between the races, especially between Black people and whites, are going to shrink because there's nothing happening in society to create these gaps. Now we ended it, see? And in fact, all the recent movements with the Supreme Court and otherwise are operating on the same mythological basis, which is that we've leveled the racial playing field. There are no systemic or otherwise society organized forms of discrimination that can account for the significant gaps in wealth, in educational access to high quality education, in access to fair policing, the avoidance of racial profiling, to housing and economic discrimination of various kinds, including wealth and including banking and more. And I could be here quite a while. So that is the underlying question I wanted to tackle. I wanted to say, how did systemic racism become so invisible? Right? I mean, we were a society, we think that the only racism was Jim Crow, whites colored, here, there, don't integrate. But there was a lot of very many different stages of society organized racism that isn't just Jim Crow. So there's this myth. And now, why is this myth important, Kara? It's important because it helps many uninformed whites who don't study or think through about racial or Black history or anything like that on a regular basis to become resentful, because they think that those of us who say, hey, this stuff is still going on and it's really bad, it's just different, and you can't see it the same way. They think, hey, you're just looking for special favors, you just want an advantage, we're actually the disadvantaged group now. And that sentiment, that what people call reverse racism, is driving a lot of the retrenchment that we're seeing, as well as, of course, some effort to sort of shuffle up the system a little bit and make some room. That also makes people resentful. But it is the myth that I think is really there. So I mean, that's the basis. And so I thought, okay, let me define this systemic racism really carefully. Let me really unpack it, because I have a sort of wacky belief that while there are many strategic, horrible, mean-spirited, and also politically savvy and greedy people who hate in one way or another Black people, or more importantly, just want to take advantage of the most vulnerable, I don't think that's everybody at all. I think a lot of people, frankly, have no idea what's going on out here. And they've been fed a story consistently in mainstream media that it's the one bad apple universe. We live in a one bad apple universe, Kara. That means there's only one bad apple who's responsible for that one crime. And we only want
policing, it's just that one cop. Get rid of that one cop and we'll be fine again.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's always one, but they keep multiplying, huh? And they move all around the country and they get new jobs being police no matter what they did. So, I mean, and also
weird.
This doesn't even, it is weird. Like, what could be causing that? So it's also that we only focus on policing, right? You don't have a way of telling stories in mainstream society that say, this situation, take Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, whose 10th anniversary was just a few weeks ago, or any number of other cases, including, I talk about those two cases as well as the Kelly Williams Bolar story from Akron, Ohio. We tell those stories as individual cases of discrimination. Darren Wilson, shot Mike Brown X number of times. They left his body in the street. I mean, it was gruesome and horrible. But let's look at Mike Brown's life around it. If you do a systemic analysis, right, which means that you are wanting to look at these major areas in society and ask yourself, what happens in those areas? Is there significant discrimination or disparity? What are the kinds of policies and practices and behaviors that cause that disparity? And how do they, and this is where you get to meta, how do they combine in ways to produce effects of the system as a whole that not one policy could produce on its own? So it's the interaction, which is what system theory does. It helps you think about, well, bad schools are not just bad schools alone. They're a combination of things, right? Which, when you add to housing values and depressed housing values that are related to Black residents and higher interest rates and denials of loans, and then, subprime loans or, when they weren't necessary. And then, the destruction of affordable housing. And when you add that to the way they police and punish kids in schools, which is pretty much a school to prison pipeline, frequently high levels of punishment and for Black students, much lower level of punishment for whites for the same behavior. So when you tackle all that locally, regionally, and nationally, then you're like, well, Mike Brown was not in exactly the best way prior to this incident. And his future, had he not been killed by Darren Wilson, would have certainly been better than being dead. But you can't turn that into this opportunity-laden world that he was going to launch into and have no racial effects. So one of the reasons we focus on these extreme cases is because it hides this reality that we don't want to confront. We're afraid because we don't know, and because it's hard to confront because the myths have been so reassuring. I mean, it feels so good to say we solved it and now it's just a little bit going on and everybody has a good chance. And who doesn't want to hear that feel good story?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, part of my job in this book is not just to tell this alternative story, which is stunningly complex and interrelated in ways that you would be surprised when I tell you about that, hopefully a little later, of the ways things interact. Like, it's not just like, hey, bad policy A connects to bad policy B. It's inside the weeds. It's like on page 99, of the policy type of thing. You're like, oh, why is that in there? Oh, because it targets this group without saying anything, right? It creates a condition based on the two things, right? The way they're related that you would never think. But I also think we can get out. I just want to tell your folks up front, before we get too far along, this is not a fait accompli. The very logic that makes systems functional applies to discriminatory policies and to affirmative opportunity extending policies. So if we do a systems analysis, if we can disconnect the policies and practices that drive meta racism, the compounded effects, right, of interactions, then we can undo them. And once we know where they are, undoing them will have what? Meta positive effects, because we know they have meta negative effects when they connect in a certain way. If we go around thinking they're all separate, we'll never see that power. So I'm actually very hopeful, but it does mean we got to roll up our sleeves. It does mean we got to put on our boots, and it does mean we have to tell the truth, and we have to still care about each other enough to say, hey, this is pretty awful, and I'm not going to be comfortable giving up some advantages, so let me work on that, and vice versa. So anyway, that's the big, big picture of the book and the project of which it is a part.
And the thing that I can't help but point out here is that this is evidence-based. This is not an opinion. This is not subjective, right? This is the reality of the situation. You're an academic. You cite, you do a lot of research. You cite a lot of research. It's important to point out that this is the way things are. Yet, your approach to telling this story, this kind of framing around meta-racism, is a way to help people who are either resistant or ignorant about the way that things are appreciate it, accept it, and hopefully even be motivated to make change and be involved in sort of the anti-racist movement as opposed to just the passive, let's keep things as it is. So I have to ask, and we sort of touched on it, but as a psychologist, this is something I'm interested in. The well-meaning white people, the people who are ignorant of these facts, but don't personally want to be racist or want to be viewed as racist or even want to contribute to the systems that maintain meta-racism. Why do you think you so often see resistance?
From that group in particular?
Yes, from that group. I get why, overtly racist people are
Right,
resistant
exactly.
to appreciating, Black studies and yeah, exactly. But, when you see relatively well-meaning white people who are critical race theory is, not real, or it's a bad thing, or we should keep it out of schools, or who are affirmative action doesn't help, or even if it does help, they like you mentioned, they claim the reverse racism thing. Where do you think that comes from, really?
Here's where, well, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I'd love to hear your point of view on this from an individual psychological vantage point. I try to contextualize individuals, right? I'm interested in more social psychology, say, for example, if I were going to be doing a psychological analysis, because there's too many people in all of these groups to treat them as simply individuals, right? On all sides of this, right? So for me, it would be this is how I see those people. I don't see them with hostility at all. I don't have any animus, and in fact, I think there's not a big gap between where they are now and where they could be as not only allies but activists for a just society, which we desperately need for our own survival as a nation, as a region, as a leader in the world in any way. So here's what I would say. I would say three or four things really contribute. One is that the way we teach ourselves as a nation about race and about racism and hierarchy and who's valued and what's important creates a story that valorizes in a colorblind story about that's really about white success and white opportunity and white, it really is what it's about. It's about white hard work. It's about taking advantage of all the opportunities and not having any, categorical advantages that you didn't earn. It's all about, did you earn it? Can you earn it? And so that is like a myth that gets banged into our heads along with, we've leveled the playing field. That's why I started there. Remember I said, we have gotten to this myth in our mainstream society that we have a level playing field, that it's a full-scale meritocracy, and that we've ended group discrimination. Of course, there are individuals lagging along with their racism, personal racism, but the society has succeeded. So that's the first thing. We don't educate people about the way racism takes place in all of its facets. If we did, we'd have far more curious students in our classrooms about race. And when we try to do it, what do? We get Florida. We get ban it because it's offending white children. White kids are not offended. They're curious. They're curious because they know they're not being taught everything they need to know.
To read between the lines of this first point, just real quick, to kind of let you know what I'm also taking from it, or what I'm hearing, is that very often white America, white society, in valuing this sort of manifest destiny, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, everything you do is because of you earned it. It's not because it was given to you. It was 100% level playing field. This myth that you mentioned. If then we say that the playing field wasn't level, and that historically and into today, Black Americans have had to prove harder, faster, stronger just to be seen as equal across the board. They're coming from behind. The institutions have kept them systematically out of certain conversations and certain tables. That if they then need additional support, that means that somehow I wasn't, if you can't do
actually,
it
wait,
just by pulling yourself
that
up,
sentence.
then
You weren't what? That was like a really great sentence you were working on.
right? I think it's very threatening to then think, wait, maybe I didn't earn this either. Maybe our stations actually have a lot to do with our success. That's a threatening thought.
It's a combination, as it always is. Of course, hard work matters. But does it matter equally? Are the opportunities being metered out just in the matter of, say, education alone, right? I mean, even if we separated the parts, which you can't do in a system. Systems work interactionally and interconnectedly, which make them more powerful. But even if you, for a brief second, just shine your light on one piece of it, then you'd have to say that, that is not even equal in that one area, right? And is so disparate in terms of quality and access that you'd have to say, well, gee, how hard did I have to work to learn things nobody taught me? Right? That were never in the curriculum in the first place, right?
And does your lack of privilege or your systematic disenfranchisement actually mean that I am privileged? And is that a threatening thought for me
I don't
as a
use
white
privilege. I use
right.
advantage.
We talked about this. Yes. Advantaged. Okay, let's put it that way. It is systematic disenfranchisement or disadvantage of a certain group of people mean then necessarily that I am advantaged? And if so, is now my sense of self-worth and my sense of I did all this hard work threatened? I wonder if that's a part of the psychology there.
Right. And have I been misevaluating the situation around me where I've claimed I've done everything on my own? And in fact, I've been given a huge boost along the way, historically and contemporarily. So let me just give you a quick statistic, which is so ridiculous that, I'm just going to use it as a leader here. So in Missouri, right, which is the state in which Mike Brown and Ferguson is located, right, that whole incident took place in Ferguson, outside of St. Louis, pretty much. But in the state as a whole, this is all about Normandy and the 99% Black school he went to that had been unaccredited his entire life. It had never been accredited. It was so bad, it never got accreditation. And that had a set of opportunities that were supposed to open up. If you're at a school without this stamp of approval, you get to go to any other school you want. But then they made it so that was impossible. They gave it another status so that all these black kids wouldn't go to neighboring white towns. It's a long, typical story. But listen to this. Black children in Missouri, I'm just quoting from the book on page 203, receive poor instruction at poorly performing schools in poorly performing districts. In the St. Louis area, nearly 1 in 2, 50% almost, of black children attend schools that have been stripped of full accreditation by the state. In stark contrast, only 1 in 25 white students in Missouri live and go to a public school in a poorly performing district. Now, what are you going to do with that? See, the thing that we're creating with that, and with the story we dump on top of it, is that when we make efforts to try to give opportunities to black people, they say, you're lowering the standards. Because you have to be, because we know we didn't educate them. We know that their schools are worse, because look at that, 25 to, 1 in 25 versus 1 in 2, right? So now you say, well, when do you start solving this problem? If you wait till college, or you wait till the workforce, or you wait till high school, it's like saying, someone's been trained with professional athletes and coaches, and then we want to measure how well they're doing in relation to somebody who, was looking on YouTube for a clip from somebody to tell them how to work out. And that circumstance really means that when African Americans succeed, they are extraordinary, if they've been subjected to this. And so I don't want extraordinary black people. I want hundreds and hundreds and thousands of talented, as well as, idiosyncratic and diverse in every way, but equally educated and equally able to think through what they might want to contribute to society. I don't want exceptions, and I don't want, right. It's not like I'm asking for, hey, let all the really brilliant, extra brilliant people through and leave the other ones behind. No.
Exactly. Yeah, you hear that joke all the time about, Obama, the first black president, hopefully Kamala, the second black president, female president. But that joke when Obama was in office that, that doesn't mean equality. Like, we know we're equal when we have a Trump-like black president. You know what I mean? Like, when we have somebody who, it's like Obama is like the best president we've had in our modern lives. He's an incredible human being. He's the best of the best.
I mean, I hear you. I mean, but he was hamstrung by the structure of society. He couldn't that's my generous reading, right? I mean, there are not a lot changed for black people. Most of the cases that we looked in the public eye that we paid attention to of the murder of young black people happened under his, tenure as president. So it starts with 2012, with Trayvon, in terms of the highly visible era of, the 21st century. But I think the thing is here, we'll know we're equal when we don't have to look to symbolic positions to counter the truth of what we know is going on the ground.
Such a good point.
That's the deal. Like, we look to those, what they call, visible faces in high places to give us an illusion that this has been toppled. In fact, I'm a Brown University professor, and years ago, Ruth Simmons, who was the first black and first black female president of an Ivy League school, someone said to me at a cocktail party about 10 years ago that, why was I talking about racism? It's over. Look, Ruth's president. And this was before Obama. I said, boy, when Obama showed up, I was like, well, now we're done. We can't explain it to anybody. They're going to say, well, once you have a black person in a high place, it's like a magical, wand. It means there's access for everyone always. And so these are the myths that we cultivate that make it harder to see our shared humanity around suffering. It makes us blame the people who are excluded for their own exclusion, the people who are discriminated against for causing their own bad outcomes. And then we decide black culture is deficient, or they're just criminals. That's why mass incarceration had to be a mass program, which everybody knows is untrue. But these myths help propel and hide.
They do. And they also hide, I think, something that is, I don't know, just really obvious to me, which is the ebbing and the flowing, right? Because when we talk about progress and we talk about change, nothing happens linearly. And when we do see something like Obama being elected in office, then we see a swift and brutal backlash against that. We see that these kinds of pushes and pulls and ebbs and flows are also all related to one another. And that progress very often is 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because then it could be six back, for 3, 4. But I mean, since Reconstruction, it's been the same thing. There are these periods of mobilization that work in this way, and they're usually multiracial mobilization, right? These are not just one group of people. A lot of people come together, and then the successes, to really adjust the system to make it perform differently, they work for a while, and many of them continue to work. But then over time, of various sets of feelings, which is that speaking or saying something that maybe a psychologist such as yourself would be interested in sort of sharing about what you think of this, but that the sense of self-worth that is attached to whiteness is denied but reinforced. So you need whiteness to be ahead as opposed to just one of the many things that we happen to be, right? It has to be associated with privilege, power, and access and advantage. And if it doesn't have those associations, then it's like real grievance. I mean, some people joke and say like, if Black people had the feeling of disadvantage and responded this way, we'd be pissed all the time. We'd never be able to have a good day. The things that are just create outrage, right? So that's what worries me is that it's so hard to really help people see like, I just want us all to fix this problem together. We are all going to do so much better. There won't be so much fear. There won't be so much running to move to another neighborhood because the wrong number of Black people moved in, or brown people, or immigrants, or whatever it is. The terror, the fear, the criminalization, the waste of money. We got the public school system to fund mass incarceration, and what did that do? It hurts everybody. I mean, I'm not saying equally simultaneously, but it really does.
And it's hard to see the outcomes of these complex social, kind of very intentional social programs when they're being dismantled or peeled back every step of the way. I mean, that's the hardest part about the ebbing and the flowing, right? Is that as soon as progress is made, there's like this intentionality to undo that progress. I mean, we're seeing like voter suppression like we saw, you know, in Jim Crow. We're seeing like it's pretty insane some of the things happening in 2024. But is it insane? Because it's always been there.
Well, it's easier to see the absurdity of earlier periods because the language is different, the disposition is different, the codes are different. And truth be told, there have been major improvements, most of which have been the result of protest and change. I mean, there's an effort to peel them back. Right, but they were pretty amazing. All the voting rights acts that extended to everyone, all the things that the civil rights movement brought to African Americans ultimately dramatically helped women, which means mostly white women, other people of color, immigrants, non-majority Christian people who are not Christian but belong to non-Christian religious groups. I mean, there's so many people who benefit from that, right? That they were actually also uplifted. But then when the retrenchment comes, it really usually targets African Americans. People don't go around saying, you know what, you cannot counter gender in any way when you're admitting in college. Well, why not? Because, gender was a category of special attention. So why are we not so worked up about that? So that manipulation of the whole story and what we've done and the way the backlash is cultivated to create separation. You see, to me, why I love a systems approach, because can be really depressing, but why I love a systems approach is that it means we have to kind of think together. It's a collaborative learning model. Everybody has to bring things to the table and think, okay, where are there disparities? So let me give you an example of what happened. So at first I was like, okay, a system is like a structure and it's kind of all the same and things are just built in. This is how it works. And then I was like, no, that feels very simple. That doesn't make it. How's it happening? It's too big and too complex. So then I said, okay, let me take about 75 to 100 sort of policies and practices that are considered important in these categories of, thinking about discrimination, like, stop and frisk in New York, the police practice, or say broken windows, or, racial profiling, stand your ground. And there's about 75 to 100 of them. And I went through each of these policies and practices very closely. And what I realized was that these interconnections were like extremely detailed and complex. So you would find in a housing policy that was related to making sure that newly returned um, people who formerly incarcerated people who newly returned to society were not allowed to live with relatives or friends who lived in any kind of publicly funded housing, and they were not allowed to have licenses where where their ethics had to be involved, like a salon or a haircutter or something, right? Because somehow they didn't want the state supporting a felon cutting hair. But these are the kinds of jobs that individuals can really use their talents to get a footing. Were they going to get a job at a big corporation or what, McDonald's? So why not let them start a business in their community? But the other thing is, if you are poor, 80% of the people who are incarcerated don't have a high school diploma. So you're looking at people who are generally economically quite, squeezed. They're really at, the lower end of society's economic ladder. If you say, my newly returned son or daughter cannot come live with me in any kind of subsidized housing, and if he or she does, I will get evicted. Where are these people supposed to go? So they end up on the street. And the reason you see, for example, that the massive disproportionality of Black people who are homeless is directly related to this policy I just named, which had nothing to do with housing in the first place.
Right. They're literally not allowed to live in a safe place.
So basically what they're saying is, we're going to build into a policy that's really about something else. We're going to build in this exclusion that's going to drive up homelessness, which is going to actually make it easier to break up communities that are in places we don't want them to be anymore, and we want to have a nice waterfront, or we want to build a development, and it makes it easier. So what's the numbers look like? So most of the homeless and most of the people who are put in prison in general are men. Men are the largest group of incarcerated people. They're, African Americans are about 12% roughly of the U.S. population, not a huge bunch, and 6%, just average, right, is African American men. What percentage of African American men of the homeless are African American men? Like 49%.
Wow. And what about in the prison system?
Isn't that so? You create these pockets of profound disadvantage and hidden impediments in policies that say nothing about race.
6% of the population represents 50% of the homeless population. And then what about in the prison system? Because it's really high.
Oh, it's very high. It's about 40% in prison. Latinos are another 30 or 40. And so you're looking at way over. Not only are they over incarcerated, but their sentences are just extraordinarily horrible for things that are so distressing. And then you have to ask yourself even a million more questions after that, which is, if the schools are unaccredited for the lifetime of a student, and a very high percentage of people who go to prison don't even graduate high school. So that's, so that means the schools are driving kids to prison in terms of not creating a space and opportunity. And that kind of lost opportunity is not evenly distributed at all. But then we say, hey, it's a meritocracy. You didn't do well on the SAT, and like, you didn't study hard enough. You didn't do this, that, and the other, and you didn't get enough whatever. You just need enrichment. Okay, well, go get a tutor. So there's this very but again, the thing is, Kara, it is hidden in the way these things interconnect. Of course, some of them are obvious, like, stop and frisk turned out to be just profoundly obvious, so much so that they could use the New York City Police Department's own records to prove it. They didn't even have to hire someone to put some external research. Like, well, let's just see your record. Oh, this shows it. You've harassed these same people 300 times. Well, you already know who they are next. They'll come over for dinner 300 times. You should be friends by now. I'm being so obviously highly sarcastic. But let me just put that in there as a footnote. But I think, there's those interconnections that are not explicit that produce these profound effects. You see it over and over and over. And the way one thing connects with another and how that connects with another, you can't look for a single cause. You can't look for one policy that's going to be ended to solve it.
And I think it's an important point that you're making about the sort of explicit versus the implicit, because very often, again, going back to hopefully the people who this book is for, the people who are well-meaning but don't get it. One of the arguments that I often see is like, well, back in the day, it was just overt. Like there were lynchings and like grandpa was racist and he just like used the N-word on the street. And it's like two things here. Number one, there have always been people who were not racist. Just because something was more accepted doesn't mean that that was somehow morally okay. It was always wrong. It's just that there were more people okay being wrong out in the open.
Mm-hmm. Or, yeah, well, they've been socialized that was the right thing to do, whether it was right or wrong.
Exactly.
They're going to do it.
But I think lots of times you see that argument of like, yeah, but before people just were, and it's like, no, they were still racist. Like they were always activists. There were, yeah.
Well, it's the same thing today. People get all worked up, right? Well, I'm not a racist. Like, no, okay, you may not be, but let me tell you how everything you just said really kind of looks and walks like it. It's the same thing. We can't see it in our own era.
And that's the second point, which is that, in some ways, I don't want to say it's more pernicious because, of course, a lynching is pernicious, but the stuff that the microaggressions, these, systemic policies that are buried in language so that you have to kind of read between the lines to see how overt the racism is. That's the part that's so difficult, right? That this is it's it's better shielded. It's hidden better today. It's more in the water than it is something overt that you can point to. And that's why it's so easy for people to turn a blind eye to it.
Or to deny it, to say it's just not
Or
happening.
to just straight up deny it.
And,
Yeah.
and so, I mean, that's my other primary audiences. I mean, look, I want everybody in every language in the universe to read the book. I mean, that's people who write just beg people to read their books. We don't care if you buy it, just read it. Okay, just call me. Because you just want to talk to people about it. You spend a lot of time putting it together. But, in this situation, it's not just that people are being told that, just basically being explicit with their racism. It's also that the audiences I want to really reach are, the liberal whites we talked about, who I think many of whom really under the right kinds of invited learning, difficult and tough. Like, I'm not going to take a whole lot of nonsense. But if you're committed, let's do this together, right? That's one audience. But the other audience, which is really my heart audience, is Black people who know something is rigged. Right? They can feel it, they see it, but they don't have the words for it because nobody has really done enough work to show what those things really look like. So, it was very common when I was growing up to hear people say, so and so, man, he's gone. He got caught up in the system. I used to be like, what are you talking about? Actually, because I had an afro, I had to go to like a barber shop. This was back when if you had an afro as a woman, you couldn't go to a woman's salon because they did not cut that kind of hair. So I'd be sitting in there with my dad and listening to more men than women talk about this. And I'm like, why did they say this? What do they mean caught up in the system? Now, often they meant just the criminal justice system because that's the worst of the whole, shebang. But they also just meant all of these impediments created the downfall of someone who was working really hard to do the right thing or get ahead. And that experience is so tangible and so frustrating and hurtful to know that this is going on. And for people to simply not only blame you for it, deny that it's going on, and then punish you for trying to do anything about it. I mean, that's just hard. It's really hard. So you got to really create community. You have to love against the odds. You can't just sink into the horror of it. You really have to say, hey, okay, look, there's a lot of horror in the world. This is one of them. And I'm going to work the best I can to make it better. But that's my goal here, right? Was to say, if you want to read this book, it should help you really feel more confident that you don't have to explain it to anybody anymore. You just pass them the book if you want, or tell them to go to the internet, and they'll be the answer,
I think a point you're making here, it's a good one for a number of reasons, but it also leads me to revisiting something we talked about in our last hour. But this idea that, hearing in the barbershop somebody saying, so and so, he fell into it, or so and so, and like kind of blaming him for his decisions, that also reflects on ourselves, right? That individuals start to internalize a lot of guilt and shame. And instead of seeing the oppositional nature of the system, the water in which they're swimming, they start to say it's a failure of my will, it's a failure of my morals, it's a failure of my hard work. I must be lazy. I must be somehow defective. And that goes back to something we talked about last week. And if you'll do me the honor of giving me just a minute to kind of recap.
Oh yeah, for sure, of course.
Last week, yeah, because I'm like, I might have to collect my thoughts. Last week when we talked, and again, we're time traveling because it was several weeks ago now. I was talking about this feedback loop that sometimes happens, and I was likening white supremacy to patriarchy. And I was talking about the way that very often patriarchy runs away with itself, and it sort of builds not only men who become hyper toxic masculine men, but women who perpetuate patriarchy without even knowing that they're doing it. And I mixed my wires because I was asking, the equivalent in kind of white supremacist society. And I asked about, hyper black men. But what I really meant to ask about was like neo-Nazis, like on the one hand, hyper white supremacy, right? Like a sect of people, but then also the internalized racism that you might see. So those two separate points. And I mixed those wires last week. So on the one hand, this runaway positive feedback. Right, right. And on the other hand, this runaway negative feedback. So it's like, not only is there this group of white supremacists that becomes so pernicious and overt, and we're seeing it now, these far right, the first election in Germany, where it's like, these far right groups that are the first time since the Third Reich, but you're seeing it across the world, right? These like movements towards hardcore alt-right movements. But then also this flip side, which is, when I see women who vote against abortion, and I'm like, what are you doing? And it makes me wonder how much this internalized, this, you know, systemic racism actually becomes internalized by the very people who are victimized by it. And I would love to hear your take on that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, that's a really good question. I'm glad we're having a second go round with it. So, I mean, first of all, I don't think that patriarchy and racism are two entirely separate systems. Because they are deeply intertwined. You very rarely have alt right movements that are predominantly run and organized by women, right? There are women involved,
Right. Yeah,
but
that's
there's a
true.
kind of masculinist,
Yeah.
white malehood and the patriarchy that is a given associated with it that drives a lot of that prestige and power that they're seeking, right? That's the framework that they're operating in. These aren't like anti-black feminist men, like that's not what they are. So that's just one thing I just wanted to say. We're keeping them separate for the sake of sort of hierarchical clarification, but they really are
But yeah, there is a lot
intertwined.
of crossover there for
A
sure.
lot of connection. They inform each other. But I think there's no question that any system that is so effective at maintaining and normalizing opportunity and disadvantage, right, or advantage and disadvantage, is not going to at some point play a role in the unconscious, the subconscious, the sense of self-worth and confidence and belief in oneself that they are seeking, right? That it's going to have an effect. I just don't see how that's possible not to. Now, people have different responses to that. Remember, Clarence Thomas hated affirmative action because he wanted to get in on his own will, but he didn't mind, taking affirmative action to get into the law school, right? He didn't mind all that. He just wants to get rid of it for the next guy. Same thing with other people who really are offended by things like affirmative action. Rather than seeing it to be doors opening that have been closed, they see it as reducing the confidence of people who are of color, or in some cases women, because they didn't do it on objective equal terms. And they think that once that affirmative action is gone, that the African Americans and other non-white groups that get in will have more confidence because they'll know they got in equally. But all of that's predicated on the notion that when they weren't applying or they were all being rejected, that there was an objective standard being deployed. And it was never an objective standard in the first place. And number two, they already have affirmative action. That's the point. That is the point. The GI Bill ended up being affirmative action. Any number of the Social Security, which excluded farm workers and domestics, which was 90% of Black labor at the time of the passing, right, was affirmative action for whites. So when you think about it that way, it doesn't mean we should always have affirmative action. It just means that it was not a level playing field that African Americans tipped in their favor. It was a horribly non-level playing field in trying to weight down just a couple of inches to move it toward a level environment. So that in context changes for me the way I hope people feel about these kinds of opportunities. But then you think, look, colorism is a brutal co-partner in this. You have lots of, and also immigration, right? I mean, Obama and, Kamala, I will be voting for Kamala. This is not a question. But, these are immigrant African, people, not African Americans by birth, they're by immigration status. And that makes a difference in this country, I think. And the question becomes, are we really dealing with the people whose lives were most harmed by this country and what those effects might be? And then there's, of course, all the other things, did I do as well as I could? And, for me, one of the things that I find is exhausting that I do to myself is, if I can't surpass if I can't get over the hurdles, then I haven't been adequately superwoman enough. I know they're there, and I know they're unfair, but I just feel this belief that I'm going to be able to overcome it. And then you're like, well, I couldn't even know if I did. How am I going to find it? Nobody's going to send me a letter saying, oh, yeah, we cheated you these 14 times, and you didn't know anything about it. So, part of this is this sort of suspicious feeling that you're always against an obstacle that you can't always put words to. And it's not one little obstacle. It's like a sort of network of obstacles. How do people talk to you? What do they think about you? People saying, why did you write your dissertation on hip hop? You're so smart. I'm like, okay, you see, this is going to be a tough conversation. It's like, I got to write about who? George Washington? And if I don't write about him, then it can't be a smart person or a smart project. So, all of those things really do have an impact. And I don't see how we wouldn't. And what I think we need to do more of is figure out, well, what are the spaces we need to create confidence and affirmation, and to create a sense of belief in your full possibility, right? That is critical. Black churches have played that role historically. HBCUs have played that role and continue. Both institutions continue to. But we need more of it because there's more coming at us. And then women too, right? We need spaces where we can feel like those things are not going to play such a big part of this human exchange. Build us pockets of affirmation and connection that don't just rely on our parents or, our neighbors or cousins and aunts. So I think we have to pay more attention to that saturation of who we are, based on these horrible situations. And yeah, they're invisible, horrible and invisible.
Can I ask you how you do maintain hope? Like earlier in the conversation, you were saying, guys, let's not be hopeless about this because these policies can be in place. They can also, equal and opposite policies can be in place. And we've seen it work. We've seen like really good policies in place to try to empower and to try to mitigate and to try to even, reverse, but they're often blocked. And so, right now I'm hopeful because Kamala's leading in the polls and like, thank goodness, Joe stepped down and all of that. But like, if Trump gets elected, it's hard to be hopeful. How do you maintain hope against some of the most pernicious fights against egalitarianism and some of the most coded but overt white supremacist movements that we see taking, hold?
Yeah. Well, let me answer that question a little bit more on the ground, and then I'll pop up to this bigger
Please.
space of authoritarianism and the like. See, on the ground, I think that human beings are actually pretty remarkable, and the goal is for me to remember that people are both individuals and members of groups. That is to say, we are who we are partly because of how we came into the world, and then how people responded to us and our families and the world around us. But we're also members of groups, which means that no matter how our parents responded to us, they're going to be group-based knowledge that we gain by knowing how society treats whoever the group is, right? So there's both of these things going on. So I try to keep this in mind when I'm feeling some sense of despair. And that is basically to say, okay, look, this situation, this person is incredibly kind, really wonderful. I don't know why they're voting for Donald Trump. I can't have this conversation with them. I'm going to set my limits for my own sanity, but I don't need to demonize them because they're members of groups. And this is a large group of people who think they're restoring something that is value to them. Now, how they got there is it's frustrating, and I just try not to dwell on it in great detail because it can be very difficult. But I don't go the route of dehumanization because, first of all, I know that is at the heart of anti-Black racism. It is the most destructive part. Like, you just don't matter, and you're never going to matter. Now, that doesn't mean I have to socialize with you if you're calling me names, but it's really important to try because, when you do to others what's negatively been done to you, it just guarantees the cycle. Now, does that mean you have a job to go make friends with people who don't like you and who are or consciously or unconsciously, right? Liberal or not? No, I'm not saying that. Pick your life the way you want to pick it. But to create a big evil enemy is not very productive for anything, including finding surprise allies, complex, interesting allies. And I don't mean the typical white ally thing that we used to talk about during the George Floyd years, but I'm thinking more about people who can help and support because they see your individuality enough to overshadow their perhaps misunderstanding of your group. So those things are actually very inspiring to me. Second thing that keeps my hope up is young people. They are just the bomb in every era. There'd been no civil rights movement without people between 16 and 25. I mean, it just wouldn't happen, right? Same thing with all kinds of other movements, the Vietnam War movement, all the various sort of social justice movements, feminism, Stonewall. These were not 50, 60-year-old people coming out in sort of Argyle sweaters, writing note cards. Of course, everyone was involved in different ways, but it was the young people who pushed. So I think as an educator, which we can all be, by the way, we don't have to be a teacher or professor, to be committed to educating young people about the world in ways that they're unlikely to get easily is a profound act of commitment to the kind of change we need to see. So that's the second thing that really inspires me. And the third thing is, cultural practice. I pay a lot of attention to Black culture and history. Why? Because in every practice of music and art and poetry and dance and painting and sculptures is this resilience drive, even if it's also super snarky and and sort of despairing, like the blues line that says, if it wasn't for bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. It's like that line is one of my favorite lines because it captures the total absurdity of the whole situation. And yet that capacity to turn those experiences into art, to help people see this like unspoken creativity that can come from how you weather the difficulties. That's incredibly inspiring because you know what? Humans are going to jack each other up forever. This is not going to end. It's one way or another. We have to fight that impulse. We can't just imagine one fight is going to solve them all, right? It's the impulse of humans that has to be tamped down and the spirit of connection that has to be reinforced. So the fact that that's possible and it happens, to me, that's about, if we don't have that, I don't see how we make it. So that's really where I put my money.
Hear, hear. Thank you, by the way, because this is a topic that is, it's easy to get really disillusioned. It's easy to feel like the problem is insurmountable because there have been people trying for so long to surmount the problem. And sometimes when we take stock, it feels like no progress has been made. But I think it's important to take that step back and to look at the evidence and to see the areas where progress has been made and to see just the opinions like you mentioned about younger people and polls over the years of how they think about certain things. Generally speaking, younger people are becoming more and more progressive. There is a sect, sadly, of younger white men who is becoming more conservative lately, but generally speaking, we're seeing that the kind of, I don't know a better way to put it than progressive. I don't want to say liberal because it's not really even about
Right,
parties.
right, right. We'll say sort of a broader range of sort of critical engagement, right? That's what we all need. We all have to be critical about our position in the world. There isn't one good answer. There's no uber victim, right? Everybody's got different situations they're dealing with, and being open to that complexity. And whenever, they say, I don't know if I'm sure if you have this background, when they say when your identity is challenged, that's when you fight like a complete maniac.
Oh, completely. Yeah. You maintain that death grip.
Death grip. I remember being
Yeah.
thinking, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, shit, I'm acting like a crazy person. What am I shouldn't say that. Put that more gently. I
No,
should say
it's
that I
okay.
feel
It's okay.
really out
It's
of
okay.
control. I just felt totally out of control. Like, what am I talking about? And then I realized that somebody was challenging my sense of who I thought I was. That's what anti-racist work does if you do it right.
Yep. It does. It's very uncomfortable at the beginning.
Goodness, it's uncomfortable. And it stays uncomfortable whenever you find out there's a whole new bag of ways of doing it that nobody warned you about, for a long, long time. Or you find yourself saying, man, I'm sick of this. And then you feel guilty because you're like, why wouldn't I be sick of it? But then you're like, other people have to live it. And then you feel that way about gender. And then you feel that way about sexuality. And the next thing you know, you're like, man, give me some distraction. And so on that point, I think the scary thing is that that could harm the value of young people's critique, which I value so much, is that there's so much, the distraction factory is now it's beyond factory. I don't even know what's the word for
it's
like an
exponential.
industry
Yeah,
that
it's
controls the entire universe.
Yep. It's changed. It's fundamentally changed the way we relate to people and the way we relate to ourselves and the way that we relate to the civic process. I mean, it is a completely different landscape now because we are all so stuck to our
And we're
phones.
all
We're all
zapped.
in
We're
our
just like
echo
plugged in.
chambers.
It's like a
Yeah.
bad sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're all plugged into this thing. And of course, when you get exhausted, when you think, okay, climate change, right? Worldwide wars, other diseases that, are COVID, and then other, starvation, et cetera, et cetera. You're like, well, what can I do about all this? I'm like, I'm going to turn on, MTV, or I'm going to turn on, Law and Order. I'm going to turn on, The Bachelorette, or whatever it's going to be. And it's so out of the realm of the world that you just run to it. But you see, that's also look, I watch the worst TV, so I don't want your listeners to think I'm some saint. But I do want to say that what you find is that if you don't practice the muscle of real world engagement with real people in an open way, that muscle goes away. It
I
doesn't
agree.
stay. Tell me more about, what do you think about that?
I just think there's a difference between taking care of yourself and preventing burnout and escaping reality. And I think that sometimes it can feel like a fine line. You do have to take care of yourself. You do have to make sure that you wear your mask before you put on the masks of the people around you, right? Like I talk about this with patients all the time. That there's a reason that is the policy when an airplane loses cabin pressure, because you're not going to be very helpful if you can't get out of bed yourself. But it becomes very easy to crawl into your little hermit hole and pretend that, injustices don't exist. Yes, they can feel existentially overwhelming and terrifying, but if we ignore the fact that they are there in order to protect our own existential well-being, we often end up perpetuating them. It's like that Beverly Tatum analogy where she talked about the moving sidewalk at the airport. Like, unless you actively turn around and walk against the moving sidewalk, you're going to be carried along with the same systems that are perpetuating these problems.
That's right. That's right. And the more they create a world of disparity and people with hundreds of billions of dollars and people who can barely feed two kids in a major city and have a place to live indoors, the more you need to run away, right? Because you just can't face it. So I guess what I want to encourage people to think about is that it's not only that these problems like climate change, et cetera, community, Black racism are intractable per se. It's also that we've created a way of feeling about them that exacerbates the sense of impossibility. Because the less we engage, the fewer opportunities we see for success. and the more distance we have from the problem itself, if we can afford it, right? If we can get out of harm's way, we do.
Yeah, hope. Yeah, hope begets hope. Yeah. Engage. The more you engage, yeah, the more you see it. Mhm, mhm. I agree. I agree completely, and I'm so grateful that you brought that perspective here kind of as we're closing down the hour, because it can be very easy to get stuck in the despair, but there is so much room for engagement. There's so much room for becoming a systemic part of solutions to these problems, for being engaged as an activist and as an ally and as a human being who cares about social justice, who cares about basic humanity. It's easy to despair, but I'm so glad that you wrote your book, that you do your scholarship, and that you took the time to share with us today, um, not just about, you know, these brilliant ways to conceptualize this and to help us understand, but also to do it in a way that's imbued with hope, because I think that's really, really important. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I hope I continue to hope. But I'm also not Pollyanna. But you're either going to make it the world worse by leaving it this way, or you're going to help to try to make it better. There's no neutral ground on that front, really. So we just have to do the best we can. And I'm eager to imagine that people can hear differently once they've skimmed or read the book, right? Like they'll hear something and say, oh, that feels like a bit of a misdescription of what's happening. And then they know how to say, okay, this is leading me down a path I don't think I should go. At the minimum. So here's hoping, and so to speak. And I think you have a great podcast. I just wanted to tell you, one of my favorites, and that I'm just really happy you're here sharing your wisdom and really elevating the conversation that we need to have in public.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, it is significantly better with you on it, and with you on it now twice. So thank you so much, everybody. The book is Metaracism: How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free, by Dr. Tricia Rose. Tricia, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure entirely. Thank you.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.